He was chosen for beauty, then trapped in silence. Welcome to Royal Tortures. I'm your host. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Share it below. You make these stories matter. Let's begin. He was wrapped in cloth too fine for his body, silk that did not fit the bones, still soft from childhood, skin powdered to mimic innocence, though it had already been taken. Beneath layers of brocade, musk oil, and rose water, he bled, quietly, ritually, in ways no scroll would record. He stood motionless before the court, jeweled and dressed like a consort, but not yet of age to know what it meant to be one. He had no name here, only a title whispered through lattice screens. The boy bride. His voice, when he used it, had the unbroken quiver of a child dragged too early into ceremony, and his eyes carried the reflexive emptiness of prey. Behind doors of cedar carved with verses of paradise, the rooms were not gardens but cages, drenched in incense and the low hum of cruelty dressed as custom. In the hours before dawn, the eunuchs would bathe him again, preparing his limbs like sacrificial silk, trimming what did not belong, oiling what should gleam. He was not the first, he would not be the last, but something in him, too tender to be defiant, too shattered to submit, marked him for memory. His was not a death by blade, but by gradual unraveling, the suffocation of identity beneath imperial desire. By the time the Sultan looked upon him with favor, the boy who had once existed had already been buried under rouge, fear, and forgotten prayers. The Sultanate into which the boy was born stood upon the trembling edge of centuries, an empire swollen with conquest, cloaked in perfumed decay. Its domes glinted with stolen gold, its palaces echoed with the murmurs of conquered tongues. Beneath every marble corridor ran a river of silence, cultivated by generations who understood that survival required obedience, and obedience required forgetting. The capital, thrumming with caravans and petitions, concealed behind its opulent facades a web of rooms that existed beyond maps or laws, the inner sanctum of the imperial harem. This was no mere chamber of desire. It was a state within a state, ruled not by love, but by power refracted through flesh. Here, names dissolved and were replaced by ranks. Here, birth was not the beginning of life, but of negotiation. The boy, whose lineage was minor enough to be disposable and pure enough to be enticing, was gifted. That was the word used, gifted. From the border provinces, he was delivered not as tribute, but as currency. His family, whose surname was too long for court records, had seen drought, famine, and fear in quick succession. In a gesture whispered to be both desperate and ambitious, they sent their youngest son draped in silk, his wrists perfumed, his voice trained to remain still even when afraid. He entered the palace as an offering, passed from soldier to steward, from steward to eunuch, until his identity was no longer a question, but a costume. He became the chosen one before he had even been chosen. The reigning Sultan, already aging, already rotting in his appetites, had lost his favored concubine to a slow, oozing illness that devoured her voice and her face. In mourning, he had forbidden laughter in the halls. But mourning in his court was performative and strategic. It paved the way for new selections. His gaze, according to rumor, had turned not toward beauty in bloom, but toward those yet unblossomed. Whispers gathered in the shadowed alcoves. The Sultan wanted purity not untouched by others, but untouched by self-awareness. It was said he no longer desired a woman with opinions, but a body that had not yet learned to disobey. That was when the boy was presented. He was renamed before he crossed the marble threshold, rechristened in the manner of the harem's secret grammar, an honorific that erased his mother's tongue and inserted him into the order of the court. To the public, he was a protégé in the arts of poetry. To the household, he was something more ceremonial, decorative, expendable, and fragile in ways that served a grotesque form of flattery. The Sultan, when he first laid eyes upon the boy, is said to have wept not out of joy, but because the image recalled a distant dream he could no longer name. Thus, the selection was complete. The boy, barely 13, was cloaked in wedding silks the color of ox blood and dusted in powdered pearl. The wedding itself was not recorded in court annals. No scribes were summoned. No drums were beaten. It was a ritual without witnesses. The ceremony, if one could call it that, was held in the chamber of the forgotten fountain, where the tiles were cooled by the constant whisper of water, and the walls bore no portraits. There was no priest, no procession, only silence, broken by the sound of garments being removed and reassembled. The boy was not taught what to expect, only how to remain still. He was told that to tremble was undignified, that to cry out was vulgar. His face was painted in layers to conceal what could not yet be controlled: fear, confusion, and the faintest edge of defiance. What followed in the days after was not love, nor even cruelty in the traditional sense. It was ritualized possession, repeated until the body submitted to the idea that it no longer belonged to itself. The eunuchs, tasked with his care, did not meet his gaze. They bathed him with reverence and shame, dressing him in garments that erased any trace of maleness, yet forbade him femininity. He was a body remade in the court's image, neither boy nor bride, but an object designed to soothe the Sultan's withering ego. In this world, gender was not fluid, but weaponized. His voice was never raised, for there was no language in which to scream. In the heart of the palace, beneath domes painted with constellations and ceilings inlaid with lapis and gold, the boy began to vanish, not in body, but in essence. His name, already a fiction, dissolved further into titles more ornamental than real: the Pearl One, the Quiet Rose, the Last Lantern. These names, whispered by eunuchs and echoed by handmaidens, were not meant for him, but for those who owned him. He learned quickly that the greatest sin in his gilded prison was not rebellion, but memory. To remember who he had been was to resist who he was required to become. So he obeyed, and in that obedience he began to unravel. His days were choreographed like a lamentation. Each morning he was awakened before light touched the courtyards, bathed not in water but in milk and rose petals, dressed in silks too fine to bear weight, and led through echoing halls to lessons in court etiquette. He was taught not how to think, but how to gesture, how to move his wrists with elegance, how to blink slowly, how to lower his eyes without appearing defeated. He learned the poetry of silence. He learned that stillness could be a survival strategy. He was never allowed to read history. He was forbidden instruments, ink and parchment. Music was played around him, but never for him. He existed in the present tense alone, a breathing sculpture designed to please but never to evolve. At night he was summoned, sometimes gently, sometimes with urgency, always without warning. He was ushered through hidden doors and velvet corridors, through rooms perfumed to suffocate the senses, into chambers where the Sultan lay waiting, not as a man, but as an aging god in decline. These rituals were not brutal in their execution, but in their repetition. They were the slow erosion of identity under the guise of devotion. The boy did not bleed every time, but when he did, he was never permitted to acknowledge it. His tears, if they fell, were caught and wiped before they could mar his cheeks. Pain, here, was not a thing to be soothed, but polished into obedience. By his 14th year, the boy no longer flinched when touched. His muscles, once taught to flee, had been retrained to endure. He no longer remembered his mother's lullabies or the scent of dust after rain in the province from which he had come. His dreams were no longer dreams, but repetitions of ritual: velvet, heat, the sound of silk sliding from his skin. He began to feel detached from the figure that moved through the palace. He watched himself from within as if trapped behind the glass of a ceremonial mirror. The other consorts, those born of noble daughters or stolen from enemy courts, kept their distance. Some pitied him, some envied him, all avoided him. He was not one of them. He was not of anything. His unraveling was noticed not by those in power, but by the animals of the palace. The white peacocks that refused to walk near him, the cats that hissed when he passed. The women of the harem whispered that his eyes had grown too dark, too deep, like wells with no bottom. The Sultan did not see it, or perhaps he did and relished it. The boy had become a mirror to the sovereign's decay, beautiful in form, hollow in spirit, sustained by ritual and nothing more. The physician, when called to examine him after a sudden collapse, declared him possessed by melancholy. He prescribed leeches, prayer, and days spent in cool marble chambers. But the boy did not recover. He began to move more slowly. He forgot the choreography of obedience. He let his eyes linger too long on the horizon outside his window, which was forbidden. Then, one night, he refused to rise when summoned. He did not scream, did not curse. He simply turned his face to the wall and closed his eyes. The eunuchs begged, pleaded, threatened. He remained still. When they lifted him, his body gave way like cloth. No bones were broken, but something inside him had ossified, turned inward and silent. The Sultan arrived in person, veiled in fury and perfume, expecting tears or submission. But the boy did not bow. He did not weep. He only stared. And in that moment, the court knew. The boy bride had become something more dangerous than disobedient. He had become a symbol of rot, of hunger unfulfilled, of empire curdled into madness. They called it a punishment, but it was a procession, a slow, deliberate ritual of erasure, performed not with fire or sword, but with surveillance and starvation. He was not dragged through streets, not whipped before crowds. That would have made him a martyr, and martyrs outlive empires. No, his execution was orchestrated in silence, cloaked in elegance, and veiled behind layers of ceremonial routine. He was confined to the pavilion of blue silence, a marble annex used to house failed concubines, disgraced officials, and those whose presence became politically inconvenient. There were no windows, only latticed shadows. No clocks, only the drip of condensation from carved stone mouths, each drop a needle in time. Here, light itself became a torment. It arrived in slivers, fractured by carved stone, turning days into indistinguishable fragments of pale gold and gray. Servants stopped addressing him directly. Food arrived late, or not at all. The water brought for his ablutions was no longer scented. The silk robes were replaced with muslin. When he shivered, no one noticed. The eunuchs who had once bathed and powdered him now avoided eye contact. The Sultan, it was said, no longer uttered his name. That was the beginning of the death, the moment when memory withdrew before the body did. The boy, now barely 15, began to fold inward. Not from rebellion, but because the palace had trained him so precisely that even his unraveling was executed in accordance with court protocol. His limbs began to tremble without cause. His hair, once combed daily with perfumed oil, began to fall in strands. He muttered names no longer familiar to him. When a physician was called again, he diagnosed possession, not by spirits, but by sorrow. He was offered verses to recite and smoke, to breathe, but the boy only stared at the smoke until his eyes watered and his breath came short. On the 3rd week of his confinement, he refused water, not as a protest, but as though his body had forgotten how to want. He began to decay, not with the swiftness of fever, but with the cruel patience of rot in still air. The Sultan, perhaps in guilt or perhaps in ritual, ordered one final visit. They say he entered the chamber in full regalia, gold-threaded caftan, pearls sewn into his turban, and a ring that had belonged to a dynasty founder. The boy did not rise. He was too light to lift his head, too brittle to bow. The Sultan reached for his face, perhaps to whisper a farewell, perhaps to claim ownership one final time. But the boy flinched, not out of fear, but reflex, as if touched by flame. That moment, brief and unrecorded, echoed through every marbled hall. The boy was not his anymore. Not to possess, not to shame, not to remember. 2 nights later, the boy was found lying face down on the marble, palms upturned, as though mid-prayer or surrender. His body was still warm, but his breath had vanished. No marks, no wounds, no poison, just absence, clinical and irreversible. His death was not declared immediately. It was verified, examined, and debated. Some claimed he had willed his own departure, practicing the silent arts of death known only to those raised among sorrows too vast for language. Others said he had been smothered with silk, the same fabric once used to dress him, a grotesque symmetry of luxury and finality. The truth, as always in palaces, dissolved beneath layers of ritual. His body was not paraded. It was wrapped in linen and placed within a lead casket, sealed with wax and perfumed oil. The lead was to prevent decay from escaping. It was not buried in the royal mausoleum, but beneath the fountain of supplication, a place where water whispered prayers no human voice could repeat. No gravestone, no name, just the echo of footsteps that never return. That was how the empire preserved its silence, not through fire, but through forgetting. The dawn after his burial arrived without bells. There were no drums, no weeping in the halls. The morning light touched every surface except the spot where his absence had settled. The pavilion of blue silence was scrubbed clean by unseen hands. The muslin he died in was burned, the linens replaced. His lead-sealed body, an object now, sank beneath stone engraved with prayers no longer meant for the living. The eunuchs who had once handled his garments were reassigned. The physician who had misnamed his unraveling was dismissed quietly with a pension and a warning. The palace did not permit ghosts, only symbols, and his was too recent to be recast. But absence is never empty. It gathers weight. It grows teeth. At first, the absence lingered as scent. Rose oil in rooms where none had been used, milk souring too fast in the sun. Then as rhythm, the sound of footsteps where no one walked, the faintest breath behind velvet curtains. Servants began to walk faster through the corridors. Candles refused to stay lit in the chamber he once slept in. The white peacocks, once silent and aloof, screamed through the night like children waking from drowning dreams. Those who had known him only as an ornament began to speak of him as an omen. The Sultan, once surrounded by worship, began to unravel in ways his courtiers dared not name. He aged, not year by year, but hour by hour, his voice cracking in mid-command, his appetite dulled to ash. He no longer summoned new consorts, no longer bathed in rosewater, no longer wept for his lost favorites. He became a man of shadows, drifting through his court like a ghost unaware of its own death. He returned once to the fountain of supplication, wrapped in wool despite the heat. He stood there for hours, unmoving, watching the water bead and fall over stone. When he finally spoke, the words were simple. It should have been a blessing. No one asked what it was. Within the harem, speculation rotted into superstition. The boy's name, never officially recorded, became a curse. Servants refused to speak it aloud. A tapestry he had once touched was removed and burned in secret. His chamber was sealed, the key thrown into the cistern. But silence does not prevent remembrance. It only changes its shape. Midwives began whispering the story of the boy bride to young girls born into palace servitude, not as history, but as a warning. Do not shine too brightly. Do not soften too visibly. Do not be chosen. To be chosen in this place was to vanish in silks you could never remove. Far from the palace walls, in the province that once sent him as tribute, Rumors drifted like cinders. A boy too beautiful, too quiet, too young, sent into velvet exile and never seen again. His mother, now thin with years and ritual grief, kept his sandals beside her door, unworn and unspeaking. Every spring she lit a candle not to call him home, but to ensure he would not be forgotten by whatever gods still watched over boys without graves. The villagers, when they passed her home, averted their eyes not in pity but in shame. Still the empire moved forward. Treaties were signed, battles were lost, daughters were wed, and maps were redrawn. The Sultan died 5 winters after the boy, alone, fevered, clutching at embroidered cushions as if they might contain forgiveness. His body, unlike the boy's, was laid in gold. Mourners were summoned, prayers were chanted, but even in death he was not remembered with reverence. His reign was footnoted as decadent, his twilight years as troubled. His ghost, they said, never left the pavilion of blue silence. He wandered barefoot, muttering a name no record ever kept. It did not take long for his death to dissolve into rumor, and from rumor into myth. In the years that followed, when palace dancers twisted their wrists just so, old courtiers murmured that their grace mimicked his. When a consort's eyes grew too hollow, too fast, they were said to carry his shadow. A single flute note held too long in the Sultan's garden could silence a room, not out of reverence, but recognition. No decree was issued, no history amended, but the walls remembered, as walls always do, and the walls whispered. Beyond the palace, the empire shifted. New rulers ascended, clothed in virtue and swordplay, eager to outshine their predecessors. They stripped the harem of its power, abolished old rights, and filled its marble silence with foreign diplomats and white-turbaned advisors. They claimed to bring light into darkness. But even as the lamps were relit, there remained a room in the deepest wing that no one entered, not because it was forbidden, but because no one wished to remember why it had been sealed. It was there, behind thick stone and a rusted lock, that the boy's last garments remained. Moth-eaten, yellowed, silent. A single sandal lay turned on its side, and beside it a comb missing its teeth. His name was never inscribed in any lineage. He sired no heirs, built no mosques, led no campaigns. Yet his presence festered in the empire's unconscious. Less a boy than a symbol, less a consort than a question. What does it mean to be chosen, only to be silenced? To be sanctified by touch and then destroyed by it? In forbidden books traded among palace scribes, the story of the boy bride appeared in veiled allegory. A nightingale in a gilded cage who sang until it disappeared, a flower offered to a beast and swallowed without bloom. Children of the court read these tales in candlelight, sensing something real behind the fiction, but not daring to ask their mothers why it felt familiar. The people, who never saw his face, spoke of him as they did eclipses or plagues, rare, terrible, and instructive. In marketplaces, he became a warning mothers whispered to sons who grew too pretty, too gentle, too strange. "Do not let them dress you," they said. "Do not let them praise you too much." It was not hatred they feared. It was selection, the fate of being noticed in a world that devours its ornaments. Priests invoked his story when condemning the old sultans, portraying him as a symptom of moral decline. Revolutionaries, years later, would speak of him in hushed tones as proof that the empire had rotted from the inside long before its enemies breached its borders. And yet, in quieter places, in ruined palaces, in the half-sung lullabies of handmaidens, in letters never sent, he was remembered with ache. Not as a martyr, not even as a prince, but as a boy who could not grow old, a boy whose silence outlived his name. Even in death, he was not freed. His story became a thread sewn into the empire's memory, frayed, tangled, but never quite severed. In the centuries that followed, as the palaces decayed and the empire fractured into provinces governed by newer, louder names, the myth of the boy bride remained. It lived not in scrolls or royal annals, but in the corners of frescoes where faces had been deliberately blurred, in ceremonial songs whose final verses no one dared to sing. His legacy was not one of rebellion or triumph, but of a silence so profound it began to speak. When modern scholars eventually wandered the ruins of the capital, mapping courtyards that no longer opened and recording the dimensions of vanished rooms, one wing remained unentered, the wing said to have housed the harem of shadows. It was there, beneath a crumbled lintel, that a sealed door stood untouched, behind it only darkness and the memory of vanished footsteps. No one dared open it, not for fear of ghosts, but for fear that the myth might be real. To open that door was to admit that history had a heartbeat beneath its marble mask, that cruelty could be ritualized so beautifully it passed for tradition, that a boy once bled in silk and no one spoke his name. His image, though never officially painted, began to appear in unexpected places. A miniature found in a forbidden volume, his eyes dark and defiant, lips painted not with joy, but obligation. A thread in a tapestry from the outer provinces, depicting a procession led by a figure neither prince nor princess, walking barefoot toward a veiled fountain. In poetry, he became a symbol of fragile resistance, of innocence dismembered by ceremony. The boy in the rose cage, one poem called him. The silk that screamed, said another. But perhaps his most enduring echo remained not in words, but in ritual, in the silence held by those who still remember that even palaces built on blood will one day whisper the names they tried to forget. His legacy was not reform, not revolution, not even remembrance. It was unease, a soft, persistent ache in the walls of history that could not be plastered over. The knowledge that beneath every empire's grandeur lies a boy wrapped in silk, who never asked to be beautiful and died for it. The boy was not mourned. He was erased, but the erasure failed. It left behind a hollow that history cannot fill. His was not a death to be avenged, but one to be understood, slowly, painfully, like peeling gold leaf from a corpse.